Here, I'm going to lecture chapter 17 real quick for you guys. Um, all right, remember we're starting off the first week of the second semester here in remote, and then we hopefully should be back in person on Monday, January 11th. But here we go. All right, so Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley is this famous newspaper guy. He had been an abolitionist. He was, in fact, one of the people who had criticized Lincoln for not acting enough on um, abolitionist causes during the war. Then later backtracked and criticized Lincoln for doing too much at the risk of preserving the Union. Um, Lincoln's famous letter where he says, I would save the Union anyway if I could. I would save it freeing the slaves if I could. I would save it without freeing the slaves if I could. But I haven't changed my oft expressed personal wish that every man everywhere could be free. That famous letter was actually a response back to Horace Greeley. All right. So 1834. I'm sorry. So Horace Greeley, he's this famous newspaper guy, and he says he looks around New York City and he sees there's all these poor men, many of which are homeless, struggling, looking for handouts. And he writes this column where he says, "Go west, young man, go west. That if you move out west, you can provide for yourself. You have more opportunities. You can become something, achieve something, no longer be a burden on society as you provide for yourself, and you can make something of yourself." And a lot of people kind of took him up on this. There's even this big westward movement push in the second half of the 1800s. 1834 Indian Intercourse Act. Initially, this would have set aside land west of the Mississippi River as an Indian preserve, but this quickly gets discarded as more and more people move out there. So America realizes, if we're going to keep expanding, we're going to run into conflict with Native Americans. And so something has to be done. And this is kind of like an early attempt to kind of do what you might call like an early attempt at like a reservation system, where they set aside chunks of land for Native Americans to put them in. But what we often find is then people want that land. Gold's discovered on it. Maybe it's okay farming land. Usually the reservations aren't the best farmland. Usually, I mean, not always. But this is like an early attempt at this. Here are some different the people kind of out there. The Pueblo, and they could be like the Pueblo peoples. They could be the Hopi, the Zuni, the Rio Grande Pueblo. And they tend to be kind of down in the more arid climates. And they grow corn. They make stone, mud, or brick buildings in the sides of cliffs, or even freestanding. You might see some of these people in modern day places like New Mexico or Arizona, Nevada. Then you get like the Plains Indians, and they followed the game. They followed bison herds, and they fought with other tribes, but it tended to be just brief skirmishes, not like all-out wars. But they tended to fight more and more with Native Americans as tribes get pushed westward into other tribes' lands, which causes then more conflict, more constraints on resources. But one of the biggest problems is if you're going to farm the Great Plains, and the Great Plains is famous for having great farmland. Places like Nebraska and Kansas are just well known as having some of the best farmland out there. If you're going to start farming that, you can't have roaming bison herds trampling crops, breaking down things, and then let alone people following those herds to hunt and so forth. And so that's why you're going to start to see a lot of people start with this reservation system, in particular, especially for these what they called were the Plains Indians out in the Great Plains, places like Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, into the Dakotas, Iowa a little bit. Gold discovered on Indian land in Montana. And so there was some land and set aside for Native Americans, but then they discovered gold on it. This has actually happened many, many, many times. This is just one example. But so basically, white settlers start moving onto this land that had already been set aside for Native Americans to start mining for gold, to get that gold. Before you know it, more and more whites start moving through, and you get this Bozeman Trail, which connects a lot of the gold mining. So it's almost like a network, because you discover gold in little places all over. It's not one spot. And so you get this Bozeman Trail kind of connecting the gold mining towns in Wyoming and Montana to the famous Oregon Trail that a lot of people are flowing westward on. And this ends up precipitating the Great Sioux War of 1865 to 1867. Look, just right after, as the Civil War ends, as the Civil War winds down, you get this Great Sioux War, as the Sioux, which had been promised some of this land, they realize they're already starting to lose it so quickly after it had been promised to them. As gold miners kind of come through, and people come through even to get out further out west, not even necessarily to gold mine. But the fact of the matter is, some of the people are sticking around, some of the people are setting up settlements, and you got a lot of boom and bust towns that turn into ghost towns. Like, like maybe hit a little bit of gold, a town springs up around it, and then the gold, they can't get any more out of the ground, so then the town just completely collapses. You do get a lot of that, but it creates a lot of fear, anxiety amongst the Sioux who had been promised this land. Now they're starting to lose it, which leads to this Great Sioux War. The Battle of Little Bighorn. This is a famous battle. In fact, some people consider it the largest victory of Native Americans against the United States Army in all of U.S. Army history. Which U.S. Army would not, like, that wouldn't count, like King Philip's War or something like that in the colonial era. But this Battle of Little Bighorn, basically, Custer, who's this famous guy, who fought in the Civil War, was a Civil War hero. I've read once he was the second most photographed person in all of America. Some people were thinking he would be able to turn that fame into the presidency at some point in the future, but he's in the army, and in the cavalry, and it's his job to force these Native Americans onto reservations. And so it's and I've heard some people act like it's completely Custer's fault, but it's the nation's sin. As the United States government putting these people on the reservations. It was a policy that most Americans accepted and wanted. So it was a national sin. It's not like Custer deserves all of the blame. But at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer was a bit arrogant. He knows he's going up against more Native Americans. He could wait for reinforcements. He doesn't. He could bring these this like Gatling gun. Doesn't bring those because they will slow him down. And so he's a bit foolhardy by not waiting for more soldiers. He's a bit foolhardy for not bringing better firepower, which he could have brought. But he wanted to move quick because he could actually move quicker than the Native Americans, because with him, it's just young men. They don't really have to haul a lot. And the tribes he's trying to force onto reservations or back onto reservations, they tend to move slower because they have old people, they have children and babies and things like that. They have to haul their big teepees. His men aren't doing that. But at the Battle of Little Bighorn, he surprises this camp. His men, almost all of them, get annihilated. He dies. America's greatly shocked and angered. The Native Americans mutilate the dead bodies of the soldiers, except for Custer. Some people say it's because they respected Custer as this great, brave warrior. Some people had said, maybe it was because of the fact that he had been wearing Native American clothes. So he was wearing like buckskin clothing and things like that some of the Native Americans might have been wearing. But people say, well, that's unlikely that they would think that he was one of them because he had pale skin, strawberry blonde hair, and blue eyes. So it's unlikely they would have mistaken him as a Native American. Who knows? But the Native American culture, if they could, like mutilating the bodies, you'd be reborn into like this afterlife, kind of based on how your body was. So they would do things to the body to make them weaker in some ways in the afterlife, poke holes in their ears and stuff like that so they could listen better in the afterlife and things like that to the Native American point of view. But you can see 14 years later, at the Battle of Wounded Knee is what it was called for the longest time. But today we don't call it the Battle of Wounded Knee. We oftentimes call it the Massacre of Wounded Knee, 1890. And the shocking thing is you look at this, and many Americans say, Custer was avenged. Many Americans weren't appalled by it, but in fact, were almost satisfied by what happened here. Basically, Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. This tribe had already basically agreed to go on a reservation. The army was there. The army had kind of pinned them, caught them. They already had agreed. But because they were going to force them to become farmers, they're going to make them assimilate and force them to become farmers. They're like, you don't need guns anymore because you don't need guns to hunt buffalo. You don't need guns to do this. You don't need guns to do that. And so they told the Native Americans to turn in all of their guns. And so the Native Americans are like, well, we need our guns to protect ourselves from people like you, the U.S. Army. So they refused to kind of give in their guns. They turned in a few like old rusty guns. And that's all the guns we have. And the U.S. Army knew they were lying. And so, to make a long story short, the U.S. Army starts going through the village, teepee to teepee, flipping over things, just forcing their way into teepees, looking for, finding guns, confiscating guns. And then there's this guy named Wovoka, and he was a Native American, but he was raised by a white preacher. And he blended Christianity with Native American religion. And he had this thing called the ghost dance. And he talked about how like Jesus was going to come back, but he was going to kind of return things to 1491. And I say 1491 because that's pre-Columbus, that the white people would go back to Europe or be wiped off or, pushed back into the sea. The buffalo herds would be restored and all of this and that. And the ghost dance would help kind of bring it about, kind of like make that day kind of come quicker. And when you do the army had actually banned the ghost dance. And unfortunately, let's put it this way. Wovoka was also a magician, and he could do these stunts, and it was just, illusions, tricks, but people believed it. But Wovoka could wear a ghost dance shirt and do the ghost dance, and then somebody could fire a gun at him, and he would be fine, not a scratch. And I just think he had his hand on blanks. Blanks did exist back then. I think he just had his hands on some blanks, but he fooled a lot of Native Americans who then think if they're wearing the ghost dance shirt and do a ghost dance, they can't be killed by bullets. Obviously, that's ridiculously not true. It's an illusion. However, Wovoka was doing it. He had fooled people. But this ghost dance had been banned. And so then what happens is the soldiers are coming in. They start doing the ghost dance. It had been banned. Tensions are high. There's this Native American who a lot of the people said was hard of hearing and didn't understand. Who knows? But they ask him if he has a gun. He's not cooperating. They start searching. They find a gun that he's hiding under a blanket. And when they try to confiscate it, he doesn't let the soldiers take it. They wrestle. We don't know who, but somebody fires the first shots. And then with these Hotchkiss guns, which are kind of like a early machine gun on wheels, they start firing rounds from the outside into the village. You see different numbers. You often see 150 to 300 people in the village are massacred. 25 soldiers are killed instantly. 6 later die. 39 are wounded. And the government hands out 20 Congressional Medals of Honor basically for these soldiers shooting up. And these are hard to get too, the Congressional Medals of Honor. They hand out 20 of them. Some people today are talking about like maybe we should rescind those Medals of Honor. But the fact of the matter is many of the soldiers who actually got killed were by friendly fire because there are some soldiers in the village going teepee to teepee searching, but there's soldiers outside. And once the first shot started getting fired, the soldiers outside just indiscriminately start firing and spraying the village with bullets before even a lot of the soldiers doing the search get out. And so this massacre of Wounded Knee, unfortunately, much of the public at the time kind of approves of this, and hey, Custer was avenged. The Battle of Little Bighorn was avenged. Assimilation, the Dinkle Severity Act. So they're going to say the solution to Native Americans is that we are going to turn them basically into a mainstream white American culture. And the Dinkle Severity Act is one way of this. It's going to turn Native Americans into farmers. Hey, you can't keep, following the bison herds. You have to stay put. You have to grow your own food. And keep in mind, a lot of the food that they're giving, a lot of the land that they're giving these people on the reservations tend to not be good farmland. That's why it hadn't already been taken by farmland in many cases, by farmers and turned into farmland by many cases. And so you're taking people who aren't farmers or barely do any farming at all, and then saying you're not just that your whole culture has to change, your whole way of life has to change, but you're also saying you have to turn into a farmer when you're not a farmer, and then you have to farm land that's not good for farming. It's just a policy that's kind of setting up these people to fail, these people who are pushed onto the reservations. Look at this here, the Carlisle Indian School. And so they take Native Americans from the Great Plains and ship them, in some cases, well over 1,000 miles away. And keep in mind, this is before the age of cell phones, and this is before the age of, satellite TV and radios and the email and the internet. And, there's no social media. And they take children away, Native American children on the Great Plains, away from their parents. And then they ship them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in some cases over 1,000 miles away. And then they force the children to attend these schools, and and then they got like the dormitories and all of that, and basically they punish them if they speak their native language. You're going to learn English, and you're only going to speak English. They punish them if they do anything Native American culture, and then they have to have their hairstyles the same as mainstream white culture. They have to dress the same as mainstream white culture, and they educate them, and they teach them math and science and reading and writing and history and things like that. So they educate them, and then they actually kind of like give them kind of like crude intelligence tests back then. And if you don't score well, then we're gonna train you to become a farmer, so you can farm the reservations when we send you back to the reservation. And then if you're a little bit smarter on their intelligence test, we're going to train you to be a doctor, or train you to be a lawyer, or train you to do this, or train you to do that. And then they send them back to the reservations after a few years. Some of these kids are so depressed. I mean, you're being ripped from your family, your friends. You're being told that everything you know of is wrong. And sometimes there's corporal, meaning like physical punishment if you misbehave, based on what they say. So there's high depression rates. Some of these kids even commit suicide, which is just horrible. And I've actually heard somebody say, now I'm not saying this is true, but I actually heard somebody argue this whole Carlisle Indian School actually helped Native Americans. And their argument was that some of these people who went to the Carlisle Indian School went on to become lawyers and doctors, and that the Native Americans could trust those lawyers and doctors better than they could other people. And so when they're taking, for example, lawsuits against the government, they might have a lawyer who has more of a stake in preserving the Native American way of life if they had been a Native American who went through this Carlisle Indian School, as opposed to maybe some white guy back east who's just taking up the case just for business, but doesn't really care one way or the other on the actual merits of reservations and things like that. Wild West Show, Buffalo Bill Cody. He even pays some famous Native Americans to like reenact fights with cowboys and things like that, or fights, or reenact Battle of Little Bighorn and things like that. But they travel even into Europe, and they're big in New York City. and makes a lot of money. And this is kind of like iconic American culture, this Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. Um, California Gold Rush. Notice the Mexican American War is 1846 to 1848. Gold's literally discovered like within a week or so of the Mexican American War ending. And then by 1849, you have this massive influx of people, all hoping to hit it big. Most won't, but you have a massive amount of people moving out to California, hoping to get gold, hoping to be a part of this big boom. And if you look at like the NFL, the San Francisco 49ers, their colors are gold and red. Whoops. Sorry about that. And but they're the 49ers because they're from 18 they're talking about the 49ers are the people who went out to California in this gold rush, and their color is gold. And if you ever see their mascot, it's like a little prospector. He's got like a little pickaxe and pan and stuff like that. But mining starts to turn from small miners into big business. A lot of the small miners are bought out by bigger businesses, and San Francisco just booms. It's still a big city today, but for a while it was the biggest city in California for a long time. It isn't anymore. Like Los Angeles is bigger, for example. But San Francisco is still a big city today. But San Francisco is the city in California that benefits the most from this 1849 gold rush. National Reclamation Act of 1902. This is a government act, a federal government act, where they sell public land. The national government owns most of the land out west, and they're going to sell the land to fund irrigation projects, to bring irrigation, like bringing water to the crops. And much of the Southwest is arid. Even like modern day Oklahoma, it's hard to farm without modern irrigation systems. And so that's what that's trying to do. And there's a Spanish speaking influence in the South. Remember, we get the Southwest. I had just mentioned that the gold rush starts shortly after the Mexican American War. Well, we've always had the Spanish speaking influence in the Southwest ever since we've had that land. At the end of the Mexican American War, most of the Mexicans do not leave the northern half of Mexico that is lost in the Mexican American War. Most of them stay put. And so there's always been the Spanish speaking influence in the Southwest. There's always been a lot of Spanish speaking people in the Southwest in U.S. history here. Cattle drives. So there's the Texas Longhorn, which is like a crossbreed between like the English and the Spanish cows, but they're very hardy. They can they don't need as much water. They can eat more stuff like dry crap out in the Texas range. And you have this open range, and then basically you're taking cattle. You take them from Texas, you take the whole herd, the cowboys, and they take them up to places like Abilene, Kansas, where there's a train terminal. And then they put them on there, so they're still mooing. And then they go all the way out to Chicago, where they're unloaded and they're still moving. And then you have these famous slaughterhouses and meat packing plants. Part of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, kind of covers the whole meatpacking plants in Chicago, and where are they getting their beef from? No, those meatpacking plants from these cattle drives in Texas, up to places like Abilene, Kansas, and other places in Kansas or South Dakota, or places like that. But eventually you get like the barbed wire by Glidden, when people start fencing in their ranges and the open range starts to die. But you get these people called these exodusters. Look at this. If you're familiar with the Old Testament or Torah, Exodus is a book of the Bible that where people kind of like flee Egypt, right? And so exodusters are African Americans. They're leaving places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana for places in the Great Plains like Kansas. you look at a lot of Hollywood movies throughout history. Maybe it's better today, I don't know. But like historically speaking, a lot of the old westerns, all the cowboys are white or 90% white, and maybe a few Mexican American or whatever cowboys. But the fact of the matter is, there were a decent amount of African American cowboys and Mexican American cowboys, far more than Hollywood has typically shown. And some of these African Americans are saying, look, we're upset with how once Reconstruction ended, things got a whole lot worse. You have all these segregation laws. We've lost the right to vote in many southern, and I think every southern state, and all this. And so a lot of them move out west, hoping for a fresh start, hoping to escape sharecropping, hoping to just have a better life, more freedom, more open spaces. Um, you get these bonanza farms. You start to get bigger farms. Is you have more machinery, and that machinery is new, expensive. Not everyone can afford it. So you start to get some almost like big business farms, almost buying the machinery, and then they're more productive. And then out west, it's not that you don't have any small family farms anymore, but you start to see less small family farms, more big farms with the machinery kind of needed, more tenant farming, people who don't own the land but work the land. You get the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry by Oliver Kelly. Most people just call it the Grange rather than this whole thing. But Oliver Kelly's Grange is trying to help farmers out west. It's kind of like a political group, you might argue, and a social group for farmers out west to kind of advocate for farmers' things, socialize farmers, educate farmers on various aspects to become better farmers or more profitable. But they also try to swing politics in favor of the West, in favor of farmers. And you could argue this is the start of the Western populist movement. You could start to argue that you get all these farmers advocating for more policies for farming and farmers. Frederick Jackson Turner, he's this historian, and he writes this thesis. And he argues that, that America has a frontier. Europe didn't have a frontier, nothing like it. And because he has this frontier, because America has this frontier, America's had to kind of throw away European conventions, European philosophies, European ways of thought, European government systems. And that the frontier makes people more rugged, independent, individualistic, more democratic. And we had to kind of invent our own culture and invent our own ways of doing things and our own thought processes. And that this has spawned more equality in America than Europe, and more democracy in Europe. And that the frontier has been this defining feature in American history, that there's always been a frontier. And people have always gone out into the frontier. And that's what he kind of argues. Now, a lot of historians today kind of like say, oh, I don't really buy that because, we did really actually borrow a lot. Like the Enlightenment, a lot of Enlightenment ideas came from Europe, the Great Awakening ideas. Remember, George Whitefield was actually, British, and he came over here, and so some historians kind of poo-poo it, but it's highly influential. And it actually kind of shapes American policy because a lot of people buy this Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis here about the frontier. People like Theodore Roosevelt, who's this famous president in the early 1900s. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the reasons he's an expansionist is because he believes the frontier has ended at the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, the turn of the past century. And that we need a frontier because it's done all these great things. It's made America more, in Teddy's mind, manly and rugged and independent and democratic and individualistic. And so we need to expand and take over new places. Things like the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War. We need to expand our frontier, get a new frontier. Because it said all these positive things. So even though many historians disagree with the whole premise of what Frederick Jackson Turner is saying, the fact of the matter is it's influential. throughout history. It influenced Teddy's foreign policy. It influenced JFK. JFK talked about this kind of concept here, and about how America's new frontier could be space exploration and so forth. So, yeah. All right, kids, stay positive, and hopefully I'll see you soon in person.